Next, we will invite three stalwarts to tribal housing who have made significant contributions to the development, implementation, and future of Nahasda and its funding programs. As many of you know, October 25th of this year marked the 25th anniversary of the passage of Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or Nahasda. As we know it, Nahasda was signed into law by President Clinton with the intent of providing tribes across the country the opportunity to develop comprehensive housing programs that are tailored to specifically address the housing needs in their communities. The passage of Nahasda established the Indian Housing Block Grant that many housing programs in this room are recipients of and have made incredible developments using IHBG funding. Through tribally designated housing plans, tribes can offer any combination of low-income rental assistance, addressing housing needs of health, law enforcement, and other professionals, student housing, elder assistance, veterans housing, supportive housing, homeownership opportunities, constructing community buildings and programs, and so much more. And much more, and this is needed in our communities. Bob Gochi has spent over 30 years involved with tribal housing, including currently serving on the Montana Board of Housing, and 20 years as Executive Director of the Salish and Kootenai Housing Authority. Mr. Gochi also served as Chairman of the National Commission on American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Alaskan Housing in 1992. Mr. Gochi has extensive knowledge and expertise in economic development in Indian country and is recognized as an expert on Indian housing and finance issues. He was the Seattle Board of Federal Home Loan Bank, Fannie Mae's Housing Impact Council, the Nahasda Rules Making Committee, and was appointed by President Bush to serve on the Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFI, Advisory Board. Mr. Gochi continues to provide training to tribes and housing authorities. He is an enrolled member of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. Mr. Gochi is a longtime friend of NEIHC, and we are pleased to bring his expertise to this panel. Thank you. Jacqueline Peda is President and CEO of the Tlingit-Haida Regional Housing Authority and Second Vice President for the Central Council of the Tlingit-Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. Ms. Peda is a longtime advocate for tribal housing, previously serving as Executive Director of Tlingit-Haida Housing Authority from 1989 to 1998. And continued to serve TRHA in the role of ex officio on the Board of Commissioners prior to her appointment as CEO in April 2019. Before returning to Tlingit-Haida Housing, Ms. Peda was the Executive Director of the National Congress of American Indians in Washington, D.C. for nearly 18 years. Prior to her tenure at NCAI, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for HUD Office of Native American Programs, where she was responsible for the implementation of the Nahasda. Ms. Peda also served as Chairwoman of NAIHC, where she helped reform the tribal housing programs across Indian country, while also serving as a board member of the Sealaska Corporation from 1999 to 2019. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Peda. Phil Bush is a tribal member of the Confederated Tribes of the Chehalis Reservation of Washington State. He is a veteran of the U.S. Army. Mr. Bush has been serving as the Executive Director of Modoc-Lawson Indian Housing Authority for the past 32 years. He has been Chairman of Nevada-California Indian Housing Association since 1991 and currently serves as Chairman of the Board for Amarin Risk Management Corporation. He has been a recognized advocate for Native American housing at local, regional, and national levels for over 20 years. Through the years, Mr. Bush has been elected and appointed to serve on many regional housing associations and national policymaking and advisory committees. He is an original member of the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee and member of past numerous NAHASDA rulemaking committees. Mr. Bush has been a relentless and proactive voice for small tribes for the past 30 years. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Bush. I have 3 questions for each of the panelists. The first question is, we'll start with Mr. Gochi on this to answer the question first. Since 1996, tribes have collectively received over $15 billion in Indian Housing Block Grant and Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant funding. What has this kind of investment meant for your tribe and Indian country collectively? Mr.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and thanks, Danny. I see in all of you for the work you do every day. And thanks for the question. It's an excellent question. I think those of us who watch the advent and the implementation of NAHASDA remember that the name is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. And I think one of the things that I can see from our tribe, we have Carol Langford here, the longest-serving tribal councilman in the history of our tribe, also a former NEIHC board member. That kind of commitment from tribal leadership to oversee the growth and the changes in the implementation of the program is what NAHASDA is all about. And I think our success and through home ownership and through the housing programs has been because of that collaboration, the close working relationship. And I think NAHASDA really made that a lot easier because NAHASDA gave the oversight to the program to the tribal leaders, where before NAHASDA, the oversight was HUD. It's just that simple. And I see that every day. I see the opportunities every day. And I encourage, when I train, each tribe to make sure the tribal leadership's well informed and we're following their direction. So that's what I think.
Thank you. First of all, I want to start by just saying, Phil was just saying, wow, that's a long time, but I look at, we're all sitting here for the 25th anniversary, which does kind of date us, but also I just want to acknowledge that my peers sitting here, if I look back at the beginnings of NAHASDA and where we were, these were both 2 champions, among others that are in the room, but these are 2 champions I would pick to go anywhere with us. I mean, we have, Bob with all of his experience and his economic development mind, and I said to Phil, I said, he's really like the bull behind the horns, He's the one who really pushes and to make things happen, so I appreciate being here with them. But when I think about that question and Indian country, I just marvel at the diversity of projects that people have put together, just like the presentation that we just had right before this panel. And that's what NAHASDA was about. It was about exercising self-determination and doing being able to do the things that were the highest priority for your people in the way and in the cultural resilience that you have, and the cultural way that you have to implement them. That's important. What I think disturbs me about, and I know we're going to get more into that, but when I think about how much more we can be doing and really trying to make sure that the government understands those words, self-determination. And we see more and more, them not taking to heart what that really means. But for our communities, it's about creating financial independence. It's about creating citizens of our tribes that honor, that we also implement through self-determination, that spur more of that. And I think more home ownership is key, is one of the keys to helping us get there, and we still have more to do in that area. Phil.
Well, good morning. Sitting up here with Bob and Jackie, you think back 25 years ago, but it was actually longer than that. When NAHASDA was put together, there was Some of us that met in DC and saw a draft bill and, pushed kind of hard to get the legislation passed. What I wanted to what kind of investments has it made? Well, first off, this is the first time us three have been at the same table in 25 years. What's that tell you? We need to do this a little bit more often. But the biggest investment that I see was the self-determination part of the statute itself. In the old days you had to have a housing ordinance, everything had to be approved by HUD, but when NAHASDA came in, it opened the doors for many tribes that didn't receive any type of housing money for the first time to receive an Indian housing block grant without having to compete, fill out a simple Indian housing plan.
That's huge.
And that was a huge investment that we've never seen before.
Backwards.
I mean, it was the first time. You didn't have to have an ordinance. You didn't have to beg HUD. You didn't have to do this. That to me was probably the biggest thing that I seen what NAHASDA did, is it opened the door for every single tribe to come in and get an Indian housing block grant. And with that investment, it's huge. It just doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Despite the investment over the last 25 years, we continue to see high levels of unmet housing needs in Indian country. So what are some top issues that NAHASDA is not addressing? Mr. Bush?
Well, thanks for starting with me. Well, this to me, it's easy. NAHASDA can only address what it can afford to address. And without appropriations at a level that we need, it's never going to be able to address it. We're never going to be able to meet the unmet housing need in Indian country. So with additional appropriations, and if we wisely invest and leverage the money, even with our current level of appropriations, we're going to succeed. But that's what it's not addressing. There's just not enough funding. I think the tribes have all the capacity in the world. They see their housing need. We know it's there. It's identified. It's just we can't afford it. It comes down to an affordability thing with me, and that's what it's not addressing.
I want to follow up on that. I think you're absolutely right. And, when we think about this, and it was said earlier in this morning's conversation too, that, HUD has felt an increase overall in their budget, but as far as Indian housing, even despite their, their budget was, despite their increase in their budget, we have like a 30% loss to ours because of the inflationary factors that were not being met. And so even though in your first question you said 15 billion has come to Indian country, just think what it would have been if we would have been fully funded. And I think that's what causes us to make other decisions, which I get nervous about. For example, and I know there's reasons for asking for that. NAHASDA allowed you to have any program that you wanted, the flexibility for any program that you wanted to implement, pretty much. You could do drug elimination programs. You could do special vengeance programs. You could do special elders programs. You can do all of those things. But when you don't have enough resources to be able to do them, then we start going back to HUD and asking for another program. And then they start carving out pieces. And I get nervous about that when they carve out another piece that's dedicated for a certain amount, because then we lose a little bit of that flexibility that the self-determination, the vision of NAHASDA's self-determination gives to us. And so, I keep hammering to Congress, and whether I was at NCAI or now as a tribe, just continuing to message to them that point, that Indian housing has lost ground. We haven't gained ground. And until they actually fully fund us, we won't be able to deal with the issues that we need. Another thing was in the beginning, in 20 years, when we were doing the 20-year anniversary of NAHASDA, we reflected what were tribes doing with that. And there was some study and gathering of information, and we found that there wasn't as many new construction units being constructed as we thought would happen. And the first years there was, like first 5 to 10 years, there was a lot more new construction. And then the money just started to get a little tighter because we didn't get any increases. And so people were starting to using that money for like repair programs or management. of their properties instead. But new construction, now that I'm back home as the Housing Authority Executive Director, I get to experience it differently than being a HUD implementer, right? And I see so many barriers that we still have in place that we need to remove. You know, the barrier in the ICDBG that says you can't do new construction unless you're a CDBO. Well, that's crazy, and I'm glad Congress is removing that. Barriers that we have at the state by saying these are the funding caps for home ownership financing. Crazy things that don't really make sense. Appraisals don't represent the true cost of construction in our rural community areas. So until we address those things, we're still going to be challenged with how do we make home ownership work in our communities.
Thank you. Bob?
Well, I agree with all those points. Everybody that was involved at the time, working with HUD as a partner to develop the components and the actual writing of NASDA, it was light on a lot of different areas because the idea was there would be continued good faith negotiation. But HUD has only negotiated with us when it was required by law. We've been after them to negotiate with us on the 184 program for 15 years, 20 years. They won't meet with us. The regs have been in clearance for 3 years. I love those people up there. They're great friends. They're trying hard. But one of the things I would like to see is I would like to see the program revisited by Congress so that trust land lending is not left on the sideline to address the things that Jackie mentioned. Tribes have answers, but HUD doesn't. We need to get the tribe making those decisions rather than policymakers. That's the first thing. Fixing 184 for trust land. I think that's a huge issue. The second one is initially we talked about giving every tribe that was eligible for a block grant in the act funding $50,000 for technical assistance so a team could go out to each tribe, small tribes and large tribes, and explain to them exactly what the impacts were going to be. HUD wasn't going to come out and oversee your construction project anymore. HUD wasn't going to develop your budget anymore. HUD wasn't going to tell you, with the exception of not exceeding 30%, what your rents should be. We didn't get that. They put it into a training fund saying, you guys have good trainers at NAIC, let them do that. Let the tribes ask for it. Now, all the training requests go through HUD again. I don't know exactly how that happened. I know the law is still the same. I'm going to fight the last little bit of time I have in Indian country to get those training funds vested back in NAIC and NCAI if they want to participate, a national Indian organization serving tribes, instead of having it go through a HUD filter because it modifies what tribes want training on. So those are a couple of the things I think that are paramount that we address.
Thank you. The final question. The first 25 years of NAHASDA have truly been a success story. And we want to see more success in the next 25 years. Tell us what you would like to see, and we'll start with Ms. Peta.
Thank you. I love this question, I have to tell you, because I really, truly believe in the vision of NAHASDA. When tribal leaders gathered together in that meeting in Washington, D.C., both of my friends here were there at that meeting. And tribal leaders that are in the room, Henry Kagi's in the room here, and others that were in the room, Carol's in the room here, they were there at that meeting. And it was a sobering time to realize we had the conversation with, the question we started the meeting with was, what do we want to see for Indian housing in the next 50 years? And we decided that we wanted it to be tribally determined, we wanted it to honor self-determination, and we wanted to have the flexibility in our communities. And I think we still want those things, but I want a little bit more. I really want the government to honor that, which means I want them to fully fund, and I don't want them to piecemeal out programs. I get so saddened and even hurt when I think about things like, the counseling program requirements. It's like, really? We tribes who have been running our own housing counseling programs forever and since NAHASDA, and we've developed them, now we have to be under a HUD oversight, overruled by counseling advisors who have never been in our communities, and now we are subject to those requirements, it just falls to me in the face of self-determination. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we have so much work more to do. But I have a vision that our tribal citizens will be financially independent because we taught them about financial capabilities, that we helped them about maintenance so that our budgets aren't crippled by having to redo over and over again things that could have been taken care of out of preventative maintenance, that our community's economic structures recognize how important housing and housing delivery is, just like it is in the national sectors. Economic well-being is a measure of economic well-being is the number of housing starts in our country. It should also be a measure of success in Indian country.
Amen.
And I believe what we're shaped, and we're in a good position to make that happen with greater technical assistance, with the willingness and trust to share our models amongst each other, including those financial models, and to help raise up all of those, even the small tribes, the medium tribes, and the large tribes, with us coming together under the common cause. I think that we can actually make this happen and get Congress to pay attention to the financing that needs to happen for us. Thank you. Ganesh Chish.
This is a great question. What we would like to see, well, I'd love to see, as Jackie said, the full appropriation, fully funded. That'd be the first thing. But before I go there, I want to reflect. I want to go back 25 years ago, even 30 years ago. And some of you in the room had never operated a housing program under the 37 Housing Act. When Jackie talked about us meeting back in Washington, D.C., we talked about what do we want? We want self-determination. We want independence. We want to control it ourselves. So today, unlike yesterday, 30 years ago, our tribes make these decisions on what's in our Indian housing plans. Our tribe's the one that approves the budget or our boards. In those days, HUD did all that. And Bob mentioned it. Bob mentioned earlier that, geez, you had to ask HUD for your development budget. You had to be an executive director of a housing authority, you had to go get a certificate, become a certified housing manager, send it into HUD, and then they'd approve your operating budget. If your director didn't have that, your operating budget didn't get approved by HUD, and so they held all the tools, they had all the control. So when you reflect back, when I do, and Jackie talked about it briefly, when we met in DC, we wanted self-determination, and gosh darn it, we got self-determination. That's so big today. So those of you that don't know where we were, this is where we're at today, and it's huge. And it's because of the tribal leaders. It's because of Jackie and Bob and Carol and Joe Garcia and some of those that, I'm thinking about when I reflect back. It's huge. It's huge. So the biggest thing that we need to do, and unfortunately sometimes when you get new HUD staff, because I look at the current HUD staff, I think there might only be one or two left there that were involved with the negotiated rulemaking. And I do agree with Bob. I think we need to go back to the table. I think we need to remind HUD of what their place is and what our place is. Our place is, it's our plan, it's our community. We know how to implement it better than you. Seems here the last couple of years, it's felt like to me that, they're getting back into wordsmithing your Indian housing plan. And then I had a comment, well, we need to make Indian housing more the same. We need to get everybody, we want the same on this. We want the same useful life. We want the same. Well, that's not going to happen. That's one thing I will constantly fight for. Every individual tribe, it's your plan, it's your program, let's stick with it. The biggest thing, and I'm glad that both of them brought it up, is removing barriers. The more barriers that sit out there, the harder it is to implement the program. Whether it's the 184, like Bob mentioned, that thing was originally designed to be on reservation, to provide loans on reservation, and right now its success story is off reservation. It's doing what it wasn't designed to do, is be on reservation lending for home ownership, for loans. So I do agree with removing barriers. I do agree with all that. But looking forward, I do like some of the things that HUD has put together, and I wish they would have negotiated with the tribes, or at least did a little bit deeper tribal consultation. I do like the Indian Housing Block Grant competitive pot. Smaller tribes are able to go in and compete. But there again, we're competing against each other. So I liked what Jackie said about sharing information, but sometimes that gets it pretty hard when I'm competing against her on a national level for a pot of money in DC. So, but that's what I'm talking about, is removing those barriers. I think Nahasda itself has been a huge success story. It's huge. The self-determination we constantly have to push. We constantly have to remind HUD where their place is, and sometimes we need to remind Congress as well.
I agree, Phil, 100%. So the question is a great one. What do we want to see in the next 25 years? What would we like to see 25 years from now? Well, on his 100th birthday, George Burns appeared on Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson asked him the same question, but he said, George, you've been a force in vaudeville and on radio, early television, and you're still making movies. What do you want people to be saying about George Burns 50 years from now? And George Burns took a drag off his cigar and he goes, well, I want to be saying, damn, doesn't he look good for his age? So I'm hoping I'm back here on the stage with these two 25 years from now is the first thing. Probably, you probably will be, but in all reality, for survival for all of our tribes, all of our languages, all of our culture is paramount. The first step is recognizing self-governance, and Nahasda and HUD has done that. We can gripe about some of the things that we don't think are exactly right, but Jackie's leadership, Dom Nessie's leadership, some of the assistant secretaries and secretaries we've had, listening today to the assistant secretary, we have friends, but they also need us to remind them of what our needs are. And we three can tell them till we're blue in the face. Jackie's an elected official, Carol is. For those of you who are elected officials, you have a voice that is incredible. So I hope that we continue to speak of what we need. We need USDA in a big way. I don't know if I see Ted Bulow is on the agenda here. He's one of our best friends. He always responds. He works tirelessly for Native American issues. But we need congressional action to carve out the share of money that should go to tribes, just like the 306C program, so that you put in applications and not conforming to some state's impression of how you should do their program. We need those monies. We need them in a big way. We need VA not coming in and say, oh, well, you don't have the right inspection. That's not far enough setback. They need to also pick up the vision that was Nahasda. So I'm hoping in the next 25 years that other federal agencies who have resources that all of you need Nahasdize themselves or somehow give the money directly to tribes with certain accountable requirements. The taxpayer expects that. On top of that, we do need to fix the 184 program and work with our native CDFIs. I'm so optimistic about the growth and the possibility of native financial institutes getting cash available locally is the key to build communities. Because if we don't do it and learn how to, every tribe represented here, if you don't figure out how to be independent, totally independent, 25, 50, 100 years from now, it's going to be very hard for your tribe to exist. And look at what's going on nationwide in the world. So my message always is, and our tribe has it, they know the importance of building an economic base so we can compete and survive well into the future. So don't be afraid to diversify. Don't expect the federal government to do everything. The more that you can do and the more capacity that you can develop, I think is the signature to really having a bright 25 years in the future.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Gochi, Ms. Peta, and Mr. Bush. We've all just heard about success stories since NAHASDA was implemented, issues that we're still facing. Thank you, Mr. Bush, for talking about the 37 Housing Act and how, for those of you that are in the room that weren't working in housing then, how, yes, NAHASDA has brought great improvements and access to resources for many of our tribal housing programs, but we still have a long way to go to meet the needs of housing in all of our tribal communities. And we need to continue this conversation today, tomorrow, and for the next 25 years to see improvements. Thank you.